Hello, my buds. A special disclaimer before this particular Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis last week with Chris Beals. We note that this interview was recorded at the Benzinga Cannabis Capital Conference in September 2022, and since that time, Chris has departed Weedmaps. Weedmaps graciously let us proceed with the release of the interview despite this circumstance because they agreed that the insights that Chris provided based on Weedmaps' unique access to industry data remain highly interesting and relevant. And so we hope that you enjoy. Cheers. Welcome to another Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week, brought to you by Global Cannabis Times. I'm your host, John Piro, and I have the honor and pleasure sitting here with Chris Beals, CEO of Weedmaps. I should do my standard disclaimer that, by night I fight crime as a mass vigilante, but by day I practice, IP and cannabis law at the law firm Zuber Lawler. So any views I express are my own and not those of Zuber Lawler. So with that being said, it's a real pleasure sitting down with you, right? Because it's interesting speaking with the people that have those unique macro perspectives on the industry, right? As it develops, still an immature industry in a lot of ways. So, curious to know just, a couple sentences, how you arrived here. New Cannabis Ventures, right? And then we could start riffing on, stuff going on in the industry.
Yeah, so I'm Chris Beals, CEO of WM Technology, a parent company of Weedmaps and the suite of SaaS software for business, WM Business. So I've been in the space for 7.5 years, and we are an instrumental part of how cannabis brands and retailers reach and scale consumer audience and grow transactions and get consumers to transact again. So that's who we are.
Speaking of that perspective, right, that you were the entry portal as Google is to the internet, right? You are a means of how people find what they're going to buy. I remember the first time I went to, Colorado, my first dispensary, in the US. I will always still feel like I'm walking into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory with the golden ticket. I will keep on saying that analogy, right? What did I do? I went on Weedmaps to see where the closest dispensary was and if they had my favorite strains, right? As I like to call them, the connoisseur, right? The smokers who know the strains that they like. So, brands, right? Everyone's obsessed with this. I'm obviously biased as, an IP trademark lawyer. So now, right now, as the East Coast comes online, this is becoming a national industry, right? You have established mature markets like California. You have a market there that has been supplying for generations weed that flows eastward, right? Including the stuff that I had in college 20 years ago, Ziploc dry vacuum bags, right? Traveling cross country. So the idea is that now that we're national, East Coast, to a certain extent, South, right? It's all filling in the Midwest, right? What brands are starting to reach national visibility, right? How many are there, and how much opportunity is there, for brands still, and because of this idiosyncratic model where every state is a microcosm, right? And you can't just ship across all the state lines like a Pepsi or a Coke.
Yeah, so I think it's really fascinating because, and this is one of the things where we've increased our suite of offerings to help brands reach consumers, to help them transact with consumers, which has been difficult because brands can't sell direct to consumer. But look, at the end of the day, I think when you talk about brands that have single state awareness and dominance and sort of, that brand recall, there's a few, there's a decent number. But when you look at brands that have transcended that state barrier and are across state lines, I would say in my view, it's cookies, and there's not really anyone else. I think there's also a confusion or a conflation between there not being many brands in a state and consumers buying something because there's nothing else to buy. So purchase by force versus purchase by choice or brand affinity. And so I think when we look at the data on the marketplace, look, we're driving to have as many people shop and buy cannabis online and receive delivery through the marketplace as possible because consumers demand convenience. And so it's a really great data set for people shopping there because it's cannabis connoisseurs. It is people who purchase frequently. And when we look at the data and survey them about how they're purchasing, brand is not within the top 4 or 5 factors of how they shop. It's price, clinical effect, cannabinoids, so THC, CBD, and to some degree starting to be terpenes, and then product category, product type. So when we look at that, that's a huge opportunity, but it's also worth remembering that the way brand is built and established is different in cannabis, I think, than other spaces because those attributes I just named matter and people care about them. So the question is where your brand falls within the spectrum of those different characteristics. Are you a topical for athletes that's hitting a great price point? Or are you at a premium price point and it's just a really great product and you have some other value prop? And so I think a lot of what we've been focused on is so e-com embeds that let brands power their website. So if they can get someone to come to their website, they can not only tell them about the products, but they can then route orders right from their website to a licensed retailer nearby who carries the product. It's giving data to brands so they can understand who is the type of person that's buying their products. Brands often don't have a clear conceptualization of that. And so I think when we look at the East Coast, I think we're really in the first inning of brand development. And when we look at the average number of SKUs a retailer carries in California, it often can trend up towards 1,000. And when you look at the average number of SKUs carried in an East Coast operator, often it's below 100. And so when you think about just that element, the delta of 100 to 1,000, that's 900 SKU stacks where a brand can be established.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, you touched upon certain things, right? Obviously, delivery is key, right? And focusing on the data overall in the industry, what you'll see, in mature markets, right, is that there's a rise of delivery. And I like that because it caters to specific, products. I'm, board member of the Cannabis Beverage Association, right? Refrigeration, there is an economy of scale there, right? And then where I think it also gets interesting is everything you're talking about in terms of how you differentiate that. How consumers make their decisions are also ways to compete with the illicit market, right? And so New York, right? Obviously, such a main focal point. And I want to get into your Tokerdamus predictions, as I like to call them, for New York and how it develops, via the entire industry and size. New York, I remember the first time I was in an apartment, the guy, like a phone call's made, a guy comes in, sits down, watches 30 minutes of a movie with us, and then opens up his bag and has like the most ridiculous looking weed and has a transaction, right? And you touched upon convenience, right? Convenience is how Amazon has won. I mean, I think that, it just makes so much sense. You're going to play such an instrumental part in New York. And, the fact that states from the beginning have delivery as part of it. And let's not discount the fact of like how regulations and structure impact the value add of that. Massachusetts, 2 people in the car, destroys profit margin a lot of ways. I'm also curious to know about your thoughts about on-site consumption, though that plays less necessarily in your business model, but the data that you get is still valuable for it. So actually, I'll just take it in this way. California brands think they're going to come out here. They've been coming out here. Cookies is out there. When I go camping with my buddies and they go to their guy, they break out cookies, right? And there are a couple brands that are literally just they're crossing over. What do you think about the rise of East Coast brands, right? Because of pride, because of things that resonate with, the demographic here. We're in generation 2.0 celebrity brands, so it's not necessarily that. I'm curious to know your thoughts and like leveraging the knowledge, the data. What do you think about what brands end up, not winning, but really developing out of the East Coast?
Yeah. So I think, look, cannabis was and is a very relationship based industry, much more so than many other industries. So one of the biggest advantages that, putative East Coast brands have is that they're here and can build direct relationships with retailers. And many retailers still make purchase decisions, not off of the inventory catalog, but off of a conversation with a proprietor, a salesperson who often comes directly into the store. And so I think right away, East Coast brands, East Coast operators have a physical presence and permanence advantage over others. I think the other thing is that, yeah, look, a lot of the West Coast brands will start to establish a presence here. And look, there is raw technical excellence that goes into it. When you look at the rise of live resin in edibles, in vapes, when you look at in the concentrate space, THCA diamonds, things that are technically difficult to produce, longstanding West Coast operators have an advantage in those methods. That doesn't mean you can't replicate it, but that, let's keep in mind that brand, but what sits under brand is a quality product if you want a brand that has permanence. And so when we look at the New York market, I think what we're really interested in is we have a suite of tools that is intended to make it really easy for a brand to go from selling a product to actually spreading the word and disseminating unified information across all the retailers that use the Weedmaps marketplace, the e-com embeds, other things, bud tenders, and making it normalizing the info that folks are seeing. Separately, New York is going to be a fairly fluid delivery state. And most of what we're focused on is the future state, which is people are generally going to prefer getting delivery over going to a store, but shopping for cannabis is incredibly difficult. There are many variables. And so it's surfacing as much brand information as possible, because the biggest barrier to delivery right now is an information barrier and an assurance level for the consumer that what they're buying matches what they receive. And so we can solve that on the technology side, and that gives a lot of power and reach to brands in New York and places like that. But I think generally what we'll see is some West Coast brands start to get a foothold and I think have some strong positioning. But I truly think we'll see a lot of homegrown New York brands because of local regional pride, the fact that many of them, let's be honest, have been operating in the gray market prior to this. So they already have yeah. I mean, let's keep in mind, most of these strong West Coast brands have an origin in the Prop 215 sort of gray market earlier. And so the best way to build a brand is to have a built-in audience. And many of the incumbent brand operators in New York have a built-in audience and built-in loyalty.
Yeah. Actually, this is one that I'm going to take in an interesting direction, right? Not necessarily off the talking points. I'm interested, right? You talk also about product diversification, suites of products, right? That's another way to compete with the illicit market. That's another way to differentiate yourself, right? So obviously delivery is the closest tie to what you do, retail second, right? On-site consumption fascinates me. There's a focus on the industry when we're talking about the connoisseurs of the THC content. And this leads to an issue like lab shopping, right? Which I'm going to do a deep dive on the podcast about. But I know and THC content isn't necessarily indicative. We're talking about terpene profiles, sativa, indica, BS, all that, right? So I'm fascinated by low dose products. On-site consumption seems like it could go hand in hand because it's going to mimic the use cases of alcohol, beer in hand, whatever. What do you think about low dose products via delivery and retail? Because there's just this built-in social element to how we consume this drug, whether it's in dorm rooms or ever. I'm curious to know your thoughts on, like, is there an opportunity for low dose products in, some of these different fashions, some of these different methods of getting to consumers?
Yeah, so I think this is a really complicated question, because I think where THC matters is in two form factors of flower, so raw flower, and then concentrate, whether in the raw concentrate form or in the cartridge vape form. Look, people still often lean towards THC as an indicator of quality or strength or, that sort of thing. I think there are ways to break that down. And I think that's partially something we can do as a platform with using the data science and 15 years of first party transactional data to better recommend products to people that we know based on their purchase profile, other similar consumers like. That being said, I think there's an added wrinkle in New York in that they look to be set to have a THC-based tax, which is problematic on some other reasons from a logistical view, and the fact that different parts of the plant have highly variable levels of THC. So where are you sampling from? What's the balance between tax avoidance and customer sell-through you want to take, which could make for an interesting economics case study. But I think at the end of the day, look, I think low dose is really interesting in the edible and beverage segment. In the medicinal segment, I think the trick there is, and I don't know if this can be broken, is when you have something lower dose, to some degree, people expect a lower price point. And so I think that's the question. Now we're starting to see that linkage break. And as that linkage breaks and people are willing to pay $15 for a bag of 2 milligram THC edibles per serving versus $15 per bag for something that's 10 milligrams of THC per serving, I think that bears things out. And let's just be honest, when you're looking at raw concentrate, it's not like there's a massive difference in your input costs for that 2 milligrams versus 10 milligrams. And so I think what we'll see is that there is a inevitable trend towards, I think, more price diversification around THC levels. And I think more consumer taste emerging around taste levels, where people will gravitate towards it. I think the on-ramp to that will probably less be starting in the concentrate and flower side and more people saying, you know what, I'm okay buying a 6-pack of beverages that have 5 milligrams per serving, as opposed to buying a 6-pack that has 10 milligrams per serving and sipping half of it and putting the other half in the fridge. And so we're seeing those behaviors when we look at purchase behaviors and data we have on consumers, we're seeing that change, but it's a gradual change.
Yeah. So I think you're probably the perfect person to discuss this with. And I think that your answer kind of cues this up, right? In terms of, we're talking about low dose products, right? We're talking about the focus on THC, what that creates and everything, right? I alluded to it very, very briefly, right? Sativa versus indica is bullshit, And everyone knows that. I didn't realize it was historically bullshit by some like rogue botanist that somehow it, stuck. Right. And then you have the crazy factoids like, AK-47 winning Sativa of the year, the Emerald Cup, and winning Indica of the year 3 years later. But you want a necessary shorthand, right? You want connoisseurs will know their strains, they'll know their terpenes. I still think I'm dying to know how am I going to find out my specific terpene profile, right? Because the ones that are supposed to be nighty night make me do push-ups, organize, clean up the house, and make my wife say that's my favorite one that you like. You could have more of that. Yeah. And so my question for you is, you want a shorthand for consumers, right? Specifically kind of curious consumers, right? Experiential, like the, say, certain brands, that's how they do it, but it's a flawed construction. So do you think that another shorthand emerges, right? Do you think that consumers just get more sophisticated in terms of knowing their terp profiles, which are more responsible for their specific effects and even potentially responsible for how, much something hits them, not just the THC content? Emerald Cup does what, the 6 classifications? That's hard, right? For someone to wrap your head around. How do you think that evolves? I mean, just want to know, playing Tokerdamus.
Yeah. So I think, about 5 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago, I think there was a number of people pushing for this idea of like a chemotypic classification system where you'd basically group cannabis based on the blended combination of how it expressed in terms of the cannabinoids, the key cannabinoids, and key terpenes. It had quantitative and statistical rigor behind it. I think when we thought about building into the platform and looking at it, the problem was it wasn't something that consumers were ready to shop by. So what we do is we keep building data on the back end where we understand that. And so I think, look, not to make it sound like, for all things, WM technology is the solution, but I think one of the easiest ways to do it is to use our recommendation engines as we continue to evolve and build those out, where people can say, much like seeding a Pandora or Spotify list, I like this product, what else would you recommend that falls this way? Because there's really 2 complex parts to this. One is you're trying to box in roughly how a set of products are related to each other based on, let's just say, a dozen compounds between the terpenes and the cannabinoids. But then the fact that based on very hazily understood genetic factors, there are groupings of people who are affected differently by the same product. And so you have 2 dimensions. It's grouping products, but then it's also grouping subgroups of cannabis consumers. Exactly. And matching them up. And I think the easiest way to do that is not going out doing 23andMe tests on everyone and that sort of thing. It's raw statistics, raw feedback engines. Have you tried this? And these are things we have built into the platform, and why I think over time, historical first-party purchase data, historical consumer verified purchaser data, where we segregate if we know someone's actually purchased the product, we look at their reviews in a different way quantitatively. That I think is easier an on-ramp than sort of building a chemotypic classification system, getting all of the arguing groups in the cannabis industry to agree to one classification system to rule them all, and then brute force educating all of the consumers out there to shop based on that classification system. There is an analogy for that, which is in some ways that's in part how some wine shopping evolved, but that evolved over several thousand years. And in cannabis, ideally, we don't take several thousand years to influence people's shopping habits.
I like it when I find out, my Jewish ancestors were consuming it, several thousand years in the temple, right? That was a fun story to cover. So here's the thing, right? Because of your position, because of the data, right? Data is power, right? And, when it comes to anything that relates to consumers. So I think what you're essentially saying is it's complex. You will never be able to get around the fact that people have differently configured endocannabinoid systems, right? Like, yes, people getting 23andMe is not going to happen. No matter how evolved this industry gets, you will be able to tell from the data, right? As you already have said, what were determinative factors in terms of people's purchasing decisions? All right, time to pull the trigger here, right? And switch to this new model. And actually, what just popped up in my head was, one story that I thought was fascinating in the industry was one study that talked about the classings of terpenes, right? And the split of there's, a certain number of strains, there's a correlation between effect and the dominant terpene. Right. So I saw happened to be a client's product earlier this morning where I thought it was very interesting that, on the front of the packaging, it says indica, but in like some of the different design in the text, it was the dominant terpene profile. And it just said myrcene or, like limonene, maybe maybe that's what evolves, because the science might even bear it out. You can't get around what your genetics, dictate, but maybe that's, hopefully, right? And you will be the one to say, all right, products, it's time, right? Throw this on your packaging, with your unique macro, view of the industry. I do, because it is near and dear to my heart, I do want to talk about New York, right? And playing, I can never decide between Tokerdamus or Smokerdamus. Everyone who I speak with, you like both, right? That's the problem. I can't decide. They both work on a level. And you have some thoughts in terms of how you think that this, how New York could play out, and the progress of the, of the market there. I want to hear, and bounce off that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to give background on the basis for my opinion, we have, I think, one is one of the largest policy teams in cannabis, which is important, obviously, help open new markets, but it's also important because we have to build the laws and regulations into our software suite, especially the SaaS solutions. And so, that team, every time a new state opens or laws and regulations change, those are new requirements that have to go into the software. But one of the side parts of that is we do have a pretty granular view of what we see in markets. And I think when I look at New York, I think a lot of people are getting wrapped around the axle a little bit of, well, they're only issuing 150 licenses to start. The key part of that sentence is to start. What we have seen is, so New York's law had a limited time period for cities to opt out of cannabis licensing. It doesn't mean that much because they can opt in at any point. And separately, if a city who didn't opt out wishes to stymie cannabis licensing, there's myriad ways to do so, including the fire marshal not inspecting the site, or them not, getting it. Yeah, exactly. City councils have many ways to control the composition of the business in their city. But I think the thing that was fascinating is 55% of cities effectively, or just over 50%, opted in. They didn't opt out. And that's notable because when you compare that to California, right, 70% are still out, but that was 85% right after Prop 64 passed. And so you're already seeing a massive difference in terms of the willingness of local jurisdictions, and local jurisdictions are what dictate whether a state is going to have enough retail locations to combat the illicit market, because that is the single biggest predictor of whether a state has a large illicit market is, do you have enough retail licenses? Is it convenient, easy, and are they competing? And so I think what we're looking at is, 150 licenses to start, but I think a strong framework where the regulators are looking very academically at other states to see what worked and what didn't work. And when you look at these cities, you see all of these cities that have opted in, but you see the absence of them leaning towards caps to start. Because in California, many of the cities that did legalize have one license for 50,000 people, two licenses, and this is retail, for 30,000 people. And the data we have tends to show that if a jurisdiction doesn't have at least one license per 10,000 people, you're going to have an outsized illicit market. And so what we're seeing is I think you have the potential to have geographically distributed strong density. Let's take an example. I believe Southampton has opted into cannabis licensing. It's a relatively Tony enclave out there. Yeah. Well, and so, but it's a place where normally, let's take the analogy. If you look at Napa, there's barely any licenses in Napa, and they just came about. And not to compare the Hamptons to Napa, I'm sure there's people in both areas who would object to that comparison. Yeah, but they're both areas that had high tourism volumes, had incumbent industries with populations that were somewhat more conservative on things. And you have this difference where Napa almost no licensing and no licensing to start. And then you're potentially looking at dozens of licenses out in the Hamptons. That's just one small example. There's also the fact that these businesses can do delivery anywhere. And so what we see that tends to do is, for instance, upstate, there is evidence that Poughkeepsie was not, in the Mid-Hudson region, was not going to have cannabis licensing. Yeah. Well, the city council took a look around, realized everyone around them was going to have a bunch of cannabis licensing. Ulster County across the river only had 2 cities that opted out, I believe, and realized, where were they going to make their money? Delivering to the residents of Poughkeepsie. Yeah. And so I think that has a real impact on what we'll see with retail licensing, which I think will be really important. They've opened up the number of growers and cultivators. They have to get around to more of the processing licenses, but it looks to be that there's going to be enough licenses up supply chain that you'll have diversity of products, such that you can have things like beverages, edibles, topicals, the types of products that generally don't leak into the illicit market really, and that demand and call for consumers to come shop in the legal market. And that's really critical. So I'm bullish in the sense that I think in the next couple of years, if you take the regulatory landscape as I think it appears to play out in New York, and you say take the regulatory landscape, which is a bit stuck in California, I think New York will be a bigger cannabis market within the next few years than California.
Lot to hop off of there, right? Have their own opinions, not those of my law firm. But first thing, right? I mean, I analogize, just like New Jersey and New York, right? In terms of regulators having to crank out the regulations and when they structured the deadline for opt-outs, right? I analogize it for these, jurisdictions. What New Jersey dropped it, 2 days before, the temporary partial regulations, right? It was 2 days before the deadline to opt out. And that was just a construction of the bill. I analogize it to, hey, jurisdiction, right? Here's a joint. You don't know me. You don't know what's in it. You want to take a puff? Right. So frankly, if I was, a politician, and may I never be one, I, respect and admire their jobs and taking that on, I would, opt out to opt back in. And so, once, more about the regulations that are going to drop. So in terms of New York, right, and that, prediction is Tokradamus that it's going to, roll out, and, California has its issues, but we also, can't forget the New York THC tax and some of these other things. My concern is, right, and I think it's such an important thing. I think this, industry has unique capacity to do good, social equity, restorative justice, all those types of concerns. New York is taking a completely different approach, right? In terms of the 150 stores that you're referring to, the $200 million intended fund, in order to help lock down the locations, right? And this is not free, here's the difference, right? This is not free market. Everyone goes out and finds the location that meets their requirements, where they're going to be the Apple Store of weed, or they're going to be the hole in the wall bodega, kind of equivalent. You're relying on state regulators, right, to go out and find the cookie cutter model stores in one of the densest states that there is, New Jersey being another one. We see what's happening with conditional real estate there. My real estate broker buddy is very popular as a result. And so, my question is that, I do see potential pain points there for, Gasney, right, who's going out and picking out the spots, right? Yes. Yeah. I never say an acronym without explaining it. That's always something I feel like you need to, do in general, regardless of what the regulators say. And Tremaine Wright, I'm going to publish an interview with her soon. Dasney's stated goal is one retail store open by the end of the year. Identify the 150 locations by mid next year. Yeah. All other quotes, the regulators, I mean, to a certain extent, don't matter as much as that, right? And we know for the full market, what they're saying, drop the full, draft regulations by October, with the timeline procedural public comment period, whatever. That's not accepting applications until mid next year. So my concern is, right, that in trying with the best intentions to help social equity, to not necessarily do what other states have done prior, right, and to put the finger on the scale in a certain way to help communities that in New York specifically have been horrifically hurt by the war on drugs. Are there going to be pain points, unexpected delays, litigation, that could delay things? Like we're sitting in, Illinois right now. Look what happened here. I love your optimism. Like I'm from New York, right? I want to be bigger than California tomorrow, right? I'm curious to, understand why you think that some of these things might not be an issue, because I think that there's I feel like a lot of people have the opinion that there could be delays in relation to these things.
Yeah, I think so. Look, the thing I was intentionally vague on is the time factor, because time is the X factor here. So I think New York may dodge a lot of the litigation bullets that other states have had. They were thoughtful. Yeah, they were thoughtful about that, I think. And we've seen litigation crop up, obviously, notably in Illinois, but it happened in Maryland. The jilted applicant. Look, there's a couple of things. I think that Dasney can, after those 150 locations, I think there will be a much broader set of licensing, and there's a stated goal of, potentially several dozen licenses being issued each month. And so I think it's a forward pacing thing. And I think, yes, you have to accept there may be delays and it may not start at the right time, but that doesn't change what I think is the broader view. Here's the thing. I think the Dasney finding locations thing, let's be honest, the 5 boroughs, makes me a little nervous. Yep. It's a little bit complicated. I think in other parts of New York, because those 150 licenses are distributed proportionally to population. And so I think in those other places, finding a location is easier. It's also worth keeping in mind that in those less densified regions, there's going to be a heavier emphasis on delivery. So just getting a location there and letting them do delivery. So that gives me some hope. But I think what gives me some hope is when people think of DASNY's process and they just focus on New York, yeah, that's scary. But when you think of the DASNY process and think that roughly 110 of those licenses are outside of like the greater New York region. I think my math's roughly right there. But yeah, anyway, yeah, maybe a bit less, but that's still a good starting point. And I think separately that while there will be fits and starts and all that, and people might say this wasn't the perfect location or whatever, I do think that getting out of the gates, if I take the aggregate of time to issue a license and time for that license to become operational, people forget the time after issuance to becoming operational can be long in some cases. And I'm not sure that I believe that I think what DASNY's doing, while it may stretch out the application period, I think may shorten the time to become operational period such that they may net out. And I could be wrong on that. I think a lot is still to be written in terms of how they do site selection, how they do build out, how they think about landlord negotiation. But I believe that overall, the fact that wherever this is located, they can deliver from helps cover a broader region. And the fact that there are a lot of places in New York that are not New York City, means that there's more room to expand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And right, still immature, right? You still have California, right? California and New York are the two places that have the most entrenched illicit markets that you need to dent, right? California is still, we can't help 280E. I'm very hopeful that Safe Banking Plus passes in the lame duck. We haven't even touched upon that. And we're getting, towards the witching hour here. So I'm thinking that, California is still tweaking with the cultivation tax. So I agree, right? New York and California will end up being the two biggies by virtue of population, everything. When I'm talking about like markets coming online, the opportunity there, I say, think of electoral college votes, right? You said 10,000 people, right, serviced by a dispensary, if not illicit markets there.
Yeah.
So, you have that population in New York. So, I mean, Safe Banking Plus, I'm curious, but, say we're, wrapping up now, any last thoughts on anything that we've touched upon, or any other points of interest, I'm happy to hear them.
Yeah. Well, so I think one thing that's going to be really interesting is, so we think about federal legalization coming. And one of the things that we think a lot about is when federal legalization comes, it does not mean states need to deregulate. In fact, many states behind the scenes are making their regulations more incongruous as opposed to harmonizing them. And as a result, I think that's a big opportunity for us to be the translation layer between states. But what that means in the nearer term is something that I think a lot of people aren't talking about, which is, and people will poke and say Portland's next to Washington State and things like that. But I think in the true sense of having large population centers abutting other states that have a large population center sitting next to it, this lack of congruence between regs, the lack of congruence in the products that are carried in the state, the lack of real competition up supply chain on brand or down supply chain on retailer, I think is going to have outsized impacts because for the first time, people have a choice of not brand and retailer just within that state, but it's quite easy to take the path to New Jersey or vice versa if they don't like the product selection. Much of the cannabis industry in Massachusetts has been propped up by the operators in Western Mass, catering to consumers in New York, consumers in Connecticut. And so I think what we're going to see is, just as we've had markets become increasingly fierce and competition among retailers and brands grow stronger, margins are being affected as a result. I think we may start to see for the first time true interstate competition between regulators on who can sort of compete on regs. And I don't think that we've seen too much of that in the past. I won't call it any specific states because I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I think we may see a regulator hailed into the governor's office and say, why are our cannabis sales declining and the neighboring states' cannabis sales are growing? Is there something we can change here? Because when you think about an industry that has such a large, well-documented impact on job creation, obviously on tax base, increase in real estate values in the regions surrounding these businesses, decrease in crime rates in the regions surrounding this, businesses that have embraced organized labor and unionization at a time when organized labor memberships have been in a period of decline, if not free fall. there's not too much else like that. And so I think that leads to the natural piece that we will, in a way that we have not seen when you have large Western states where, the population centers are not directly next to the neighboring state often, but a different level of awareness when somebody is looking at, let's say, Northern New Jersey and wondering, why are so many people buying cannabis in New York City? Or somebody sitting in Connecticut and wondering, why are so many people going to Massachusetts? I think these are natural questions. You take a small but mighty state like Rhode Island. How are they going to fit into the niche of recreational cannabis? It had better be a strong play, because you can drive, not too far in any direction and get to another state that will soon be legalized for adult use.
Yeah. There are 8 different stories and data points that I would love to, say, but I want you to have the last word, because I think that is so on point, and that is also a point that is not being made, just like you said. It's one thing where Cuomo is saying, when you didn't really care about cannabis, and the scandal being the gift that gave twice to the New York weed industry, like, oh, we're meeting with all the governors, here's a photo op, we're all going to dive in. This is on the other end, right? And viewing it competitively. And, the Pennsylvania regulator sitting there being like, right. So all I will say is I completely agree. And I think that's a great point. And, thank you so much for joining. It was the honor and pleasure that I thought would be, and sharing your insight and, riffing on these topics that we both, are so invested in and find interesting. So, thank you, Chris. And I'm going to do the customary sign off, because I love my pot puns. Stay grassy, my buds, and I will see you next episode.